Try to be as professional as possible.
All right.
Okay. Let me just set this up here. All right, today is the 25th, right?
25th.
Okay, because I just have to put that on a tape. Okay, today is June 25th, 1994. We're in New York. This is Anita Grouss interviewing. And if you could introduce yourself.
Okay. My name is Tom Berman, and I live in Kibbutz Amiyad in Israel. And I'm one of the Czech Kindertransport kinder.
Now, before we go into your story, you're about to tell me a story about Lady Chatham, was it?
No, I was going to tell you about the British Refugee Committee,
Yes.
Which operated in Prague in 1938 and 1939. It was run by a woman called Doreen Warrener, and their main function was really helping political refugees who were swarming into Prague, first from Germany, then from Austria, and finally from the Sudetenland. I really don't know too much about this committee, who founded it or sponsored it, but eventually the Kindertransport operation functioned under the aegis of this committee. So when Nicky Winton set things up in December, January 1939, he had to have the blessings of this British refugee committee and worked under that umbrella, although his operation was essentially independent, and the original committee work did not include children at all. The British Refugee Committee, after Winton left, the man who was running the Kindertransport operation was a man called Trevor Chadwick. And Trevor Chadwick must have worked until about March or April 1939, but was essentially fired because the suspicion was that he was becoming too friendly with the Nazis. Obviously, he had to have a lot of connections with them in order to facilitate running the Kindertransport. But Doreen Warner and some other people were a bit suspicious, so he left more or less under a cloud, although Trevor Chadwick was the one name that I had heard about before I'd heard of Winton or Barazetti. Now, I assume that what happened was that then Barazetti took over in Prague. But what Nicky Winton had told me was that he simply didn't remember. He knew that, in fact, he told me the story about Chadwick, and Barazetti told me the same story about Chadwick. But there was this sort of blank about who exactly was running things in Prague. And from what we now know, it was Barazetti. And the operation, as I say, there was continuous contact between Barazetti and Doreen Warrener. And in fact, what I didn't know that Barazetti told me when I met him in London in May was that they actually had a hostel for children where they kind of held the children, those who had no homes, until they could get them on the Kindertransport. And Barazetti said that he worked, of course, mostly in Prague, and that he was more or less underground. He kept changing apartments where he stayed. Those were mostly Jewish apartments. But that he also would travel to some of the outlying towns. I guess I had asked him how come, because I still don't know how my parents managed to get me on a Kindertransport, because we didn't live in Prague. We lived actually quite a long way away. So apparently the day-to-day running of the Kindertransport operation was in the hands of Barazetti until August, when he left, when he said it was apparent already, that it was definite that the Germans wouldn't allow any more transports.
Okay, go ahead. So he claims he left in August of 39, correct?
Yeah, right.
Now, one of the questions that I had was that Barazetti talked about some flights that were organized before the actual train transports.
Right, right.
Now, was that organized by this Trevor Chatwick? Because Barazetti doesn't seem to have a very clear recollection of those events.
Okay, well, what Nikki told me was that they had started by trying to fly children out, and in fact, I didn't know, Debbie told me last night, one of the women at the table, when at that first evening dinner in Jerusalem, actually was, and I think she now lives in Sweden, this woman, was actually one of the children that went by the flights. Mm-hmm. I've never met anybody that went out that way. But Nikki told me that the flights were not successful because two reasons. One, they were too slow in terms of the amounts of children that they could take out. And secondly, that they realized that one of the people that was very much involved, a woman, was an SS agent. So they then discontinued the flights. Now, my guess is that Chatwick had to have been involved in that because, and it may well be that Chatwick and Barazetti worked together for a while, because Barazetti told me that somewhere, now it's not clear when, he had been, you see, he had been working for the British Refugee Council in Prague, probably in '38. Nothing to do with Kindertransport. And it's not clear to me, this next time I see him I have to try and clarify, how it had come about that he had been working for this council. And one day he was approached by Doreen Warner, who asked him if he would be willing to handle this Kindertransport business. And this had to be after or at the time when Nikki was setting it up, because it would be obvious Nikki would presumably been trying to get all these various people who are involved, get them together in some sort of organized fashion, and presumably that would be about the time when Barazetti would have been approached by Doreen Warner to do that. Now, where exactly Chatwick, who's dead, by the way, where Chatwick would have fitted in, I'm not sure.
Do we know anything more about Chatwick? I mean, did he leave any memoirs or anything?
There is stuff about Chatwick. Now, I don't know, if you look at some of the early Kindertransport volumes, you know, there are a few things that were written before 1989, and they mention Chatwick, and it would be interesting to get hold of. Now, there must be documentation on this British Refugee Council, as again, I don't know under what aegis they worked. For example, I know that Nicky became, how did Nicky become involved in all this? Nicky, although he was a banker, was a socialist or was a supporter of the Labour Party and was very involved in refugee work before he ever set up the Kindertransport thing and so on. And he had, the story is that he was supposed to be going skiing in Switzerland, and a friend of his, name of whom I can't remember, had phoned him and said, Nicky, look, you've got to come to Prague, forget skiing, come to Prague and see what's going on here. And that was in December 1938.
Right. And his friend, I think, was involved in some of the refugees in Prague at that time.
Yeah, I assume so. I forget the name of this guy, but...
So he might have actually been working with Chatwick.
May have. I mean, I would imagine that this British Refugee Council was a sort of cover organization for a number of independent efforts that were going on at that time.
Now, how is it they came to know that one of the people involved with the airplane flights was an SS agent?
I have no idea. But, I mean, they obviously had all kinds of connection with Czech intelligence and other people.
Now, okay, I guess we could go on and on about this Nikki Berzetti conflict, but.
Well, anyhow, let me tell you that just to finish that particular topic. When I left Nikki that night before I went to see Berzetti, it was clear. Nikki had told me that he was upset with Berzetti because they had been in contact before Berzetti went to Jerusalem, and he had asked him to contact him again after he came back because there were some things that he wanted Berzetti to do, and he'd never heard from Berzetti. So when I saw Berzetti at the end of spending 2 or 3 hours with him, I said to him, "Look, Nikki would very much like to see you," and he said, "Yes, I have been remiss and I've been very busy, and I will get to see Nikki." So after when a couple of days passed, I had a chance. I phoned up Nikki, and actually he wasn't in. I talked to Greta, his wife. I said, "Look, I've talked to Berzetti, and Berzetti is a bit what's the word? Apologetic, and he does, he will indeed he will contact you." But when I saw Berzetti in Jerusalem, I said to him, "Did you see Nikki?" And he said, "No, I'm sorry, I've still not had a chance to see him." So it's a bit of a shame, but it's not. They have met on and off occasionally. Now, the other weird thing is I don't know who invited Berzetti to the '89 meeting, the reunion, but Berzetti was there. And Vera Gissing told me that he was completely unapproachable at the that she had come to him. Now, first of all, it means that somebody knew about Berzetti enough to invite him to that thing. And I don't know, I have to get hold of Bertha, but Bertha's also pretty dodgy. I think I already asked her and didn't get any clear answer whatsoever. But the question is, who, okay, Winton we knew about because it was in the paper and all this. Who knew about Berzetti enough to invite him to the '89 thing? And then when he was apparently approached by Vera and probably other people, he said, "Well, I'm not really sure why I'm here, and I did very little," and was very unapproachable. Didn't come out with his story at all. And the whole Berzetti story came out, first of all, to Mordor Siegel, as far as I know, at a PEN meeting in Holland or something.
And that was before or after this '89?
After, as far as I know. So it may be a case here of the 50-year syndrome, and something happened and all this suddenly came out, and or came out in the sense that Berzetti was willing to talk and told his story. And then when he was in Israel, he told the story again to the people who were to Hugo Meron's house and so on. And then he told me the whole story again when I met him in London, because I hadn't been at Meron's house. So there are a few things which aren't quite clear. But that's about what I know.
Well, that's not so much. That's pretty good. I mean, I have to say that I'm trying to also piece things together, and there's a lot of blanks, but a lot of it is memory blanks, lack of actual documentation, because according to Berzetti, he saved no papers.
Yeah. Well, Berzetti told me that he'd had 3 years in the war when he was interrogating Nazi flyers, that it was just so intense that was it. He kind of wiped everything out. And it may be that it's again a case that just time had to pass, and maybe meeting Mordor, who was not from the Kindertransport, but somehow just triggered all this stuff. I would be really curious to know who knew about Berzetti to invite him to that reunion.
Yeah, you'll have to ask Bill when you see him.
Yeah. Well, he wouldn't know who invited him. He probably just got an invitation.
He wouldn't show up. I mean, just.
No, obviously somebody invited him. I think. I wouldn't.
It's very funny. Well, anyway, let's get to your story now. Why don't you tell us about when you were born, where you were born, what you recall about your early years in Czechoslovakia.
Okay, I was born in February 1934, and we lived in a small town called Ronov, which is just across what is now the Polish and was then the German border. It's about 180 kilometers northeast of Prague in Bohemia. And my parents were married just a couple of years prior to that. My father built a very elegant villa in 1933. My father was the manager of a textile plant, one of the Pick plants. Pick was a family that is very well known throughout Central Europe, particularly in Czechoslovakia, connected with textiles. And actually the owner of the plant was a distant relative of my father's. Turned out to be a fairly big plant, which I didn't know until recently.
Just a minute. Hello? Well, you learned about the plant that your father was the manager for.
You're right, and there was about 400 or 500 workers, and of course it was the major industry in this rather small town. I went on the Kindertransport in July 1939. So at that time I was 5 1/4, and quite frankly I have very few recollections, if any, of Czechoslovakia, my parents, or even the trip to Britain. So that's almost it in a nutshell. I mean, there are very few things that I can say I remember. It was rather weird because I had a lot of documentation from my family after the war.
How did you obtain these documents?
Well, I had an aunt and uncle who survived the war, mainly by virtue of the fact that my uncle was not Jewish. And they had, immediately after the war, gone back to Ronov and received back from the people there all kinds of silverware and linens and documentation, more importantly. And also, they too had a fair amount of family documentation. So we have a lot of that still. And in 1964 was the first time that I had been back to Czechoslovakia since I was a child. At that time, we were going to Israel after having spent 8 years in the States, and we had bought a car in Scotland. We were 2 small kids in the back, and we drove through Europe and to Czechoslovakia. And it's a long story, which maybe I won't go into here, but when we were in Ronov and driving up the road, the house is situated on a small side road, and just before we went around a bend in the road, I knew we were going to see the house. It was very strange, and indeed we saw the house. But as I say, I have very few, if some strange things which which may be true recollections or not. I really don't know.
Like what sort of things do you...
Well, like I know that my father had a car, and I seem to remember it had a kind of leather and wood inside. I remember on the trip to Britain that we went through something that had lots and lots of windows. Maybe it was a gangplank with windows, you know, that sort of thing. But these are not memories which I can, you know, I don't know whether they're real memories or maybe just something that I've been imagining so many years.
Are these things that you think about periodically, or they come up because of specific questions? Or?
No, I think I've always had that with me, but the whole Kindertransport business is not something which has particularly preoccupied me, certainly not until '89 when we had this reunion, or until I met Nicky Winton. I mean, it was something that I knew about, and occasionally I'd meet people who had also been through the Kindertransport, but because I was on the young end of the grade, And because I had gone directly to a family in Scotland where I grew up and stayed with that family, I had not really much connection to other people in Kindertransport. I knew a few others in Scotland or in Glasgow who had been through Kindertransport, but that was about it. And so I didn't have the connections, say, like the Czechs who had been through the Czech school in Wales, or people like that, or people who had been in hostels together. And it was something that I knew about and something that I carried around, but nothing that I was really preoccupied with, or that had played a sort of major part in my thinking.
Did you feel at all disconnected because you didn't have these communal type connections with people who had similar experiences?
No, because I grew up in Scotland, in Glasgow. I was very involved in things like Scouts and then Habonim, the Zionist youth movement, and it was not something that was lacking for me.
Let me just go back a little bit to your family. What were your parents' names?
My father was called Karl Berman, and my mother was called Leontina. She was mostly known by her nickname of Teeny, Eagle. I know much more about my mother's side than about my father's side. Again, because of this aunt and uncle who, as I say, survived the war. They had no children, and they ended up living in the States. They came here in 1950, and because of them, actually, I had an opportunity to come to the States and study, and I owe my education to them, really. But they had, as I said before, a lot of papers and a lot of documentation. One rather nice thing, which if you're interested, I can send you a copy. When I first came to Scotland, my aunt, Isa, wrote a biography of my mother and herself growing up as two little girls in Moravia and Bohemia, in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, in the years just prior to the World War and through the World War. She wrote this. It's about 6 or 8 typewritten pages in English. And first of all, it's amazing because the English is unbelievably good when you realize that these people had never been in an English-speaking country. And describing growing up as the daughters of a country physician in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in those years. So if you're interested, I can send you that. And of course, also at the beginning, when I first arrived in Scotland for the first few years, we had correspondence with my parents. And I always knew that the family where I was, who also had no children, so I was an only child there too, I always knew that they were not my real parents. In fact, the woman who is still alive, I call her Ta for Tante, because when I came there, they spoke Yiddish, or they knew Yiddish, and of course we had grown up with Czech, but I knew German from my grandparents, so they would speak to me in Yiddish in Glasgow, and I would answer in German until I learned English, which went pretty quickly too, I guess.
Now, what were the names of your aunt and uncle?
They were Isa and Walter Hine. Walter was a lawyer, a very fine man, and he, as I say, he was non-Jewish, and as a result of that, they lived in Strebro, or Mis, which is a town in the Sudetenland. And they survived the war because of his not being Jewish, but he they lost everything during the war because he wouldn't divorce my aunt. And
where were they during the war?
they lived in Strebro throughout the war.
Mm-hmm.
And after the war, things began to, he began to put together his practice again, but after the communists came in, everything collapsed. So they ended up first spending a couple of years in Germany when I went to visit them in 1949 and 1950. And in the fall of 1950, they came to the States. And then subsequently in 1956, through their efforts, I was able to come here to do a college education. So that was their story.
Now, what was your aunt's and your mother's maiden name?
Eagle, I-G-E-L.
And what was their father's name?
Their father's name was Moses Eagle. And as I say, he was a physician. For a while he worked as a railway physician, and he also had had some of these practices in small villages. Partly the story is that as a young man he'd studied in Vienna, and he was a bit of a gambler, so my grandmother said in order to get him away from this bad influence, that he took these jobs in out-of-the-way places. But whether that's apocryphal or not, I don't know.
And what was your mother's name? Do you know? Moses' wife.
Yeah, I should know. I mean, we have birth certificates and death certificates and school certificates. But her name eludes me at this point.
Well, that's
My wife probably knows. I can get all that to you because I have, in fact, we have quite, on my mother's side, we have family genealogy going back a few more generations. I know, for example, that two of my grandfathers lived in this large town called Chernovich, which I think is now in Romania. It's sort of Romania-Ukraine border. And one of them was the chief rabbi of Chernovich, and the other one was a cantor. And none of his musical gifts have ever descended on any to me or to any of my kids. But as I say, we have all kinds of documents relating to these people. On my father's side, we have much less. But again, I don't remember offhand the names of my paternal grandparents. But I do have that, and also of, say, the relatives. My father had a married sister and a married brother, whose names were. Brother was Otto. The sister was, I think, Frida. I'm not absolutely certain of that.
And did any of them survive?
Nobody survived. None. I was really the only survivor of my family. The only survivors that I knew about until fairly recently were two second cousins from my father's side. Now, on my father's side, at the level of the grandmothers, there were 5 sisters. And they were family pick, which I had mentioned before. So there were 5 a grandmother and 4 grandaunts. And one of these grandaunts, in fact, showed up in Glasgow in 1947 or so. She had survived the war with a son of hers who lived in Switzerland, and for some reason she came to Glasgow, ostensibly en route to stay with her two surviving daughters who lived in Colorado. This was after the war already. She came to Glasgow to stay for a week or so and ended up staying for 2 years. But she, of course, died many years ago. And as I say, at the level of my grandmother on my father's side, there were 5 sisters. Now, there were grandchildren of these sisters who survived. So by chance, I was contacted by one of them who lives now in Chile. And that's a rather strange story because I had been among the first 3 Israelis who went to a scientific meeting in Leningrad in 1971. And we were the first Israelis to be allowed into the Soviet Union officially after the Six-Day War, and this was written up in the Jerusalem Post. And my cousin from Chile, who was at that time in Israel to visit a daughter of hers, saw this name in the Jerusalem Post, and I got a postcard saying, if you're the Tommy Berman that was sent to Scotland in 1939, please contact us. So that was how I discovered my cousin in Chile, and through her I found out that I have another second cousin who lives in Venezuela. And in fact, the Venezuelan cousin had been in Israel about the same time when I was first in Israel, which was 1951-52. But we hadn't known about each other, and they had subsequently gone to live in Venezuela. So I had these two second cousins.
And what are their names?
Their name, the one in Venezuela is called Hans Gutmann, Hans and Eva Gutmann. And Eva actually comes from Budovice.
Really?
Yeah. And the cousins in Chile are called Herzfeld. She, who is my cousin, is Kati, and he's called Helmut Herzfeld. And we, in fact, went to Chile. We spent 3 months there last year during my sabbatical. We see them fairly often because they have a daughter in Israel, so they come, they've been coming almost every year there. And we finally had a chance of seeing them, being with them also in Chile last year.
Do they have children as well?
Yeah, they have a daughter and a son. And
have your children met their children?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, at least the daughter who lives in Israel, all our kids have met them, yeah.
Your family, before you left, were they a religious family?
No, not at all. Not at all. They were quite assimilated, I guess you'd say. And what I forgot to mention is that I turned up another second cousin I didn't know about just recently, and that was in 1990. My wife and I went to Czechoslovakia, and when we got back from Prague, there was a letter waiting for me from Vera Gissing. And Vera wrote saying, hey, you know, we're vaguely related. The story being that she had a cousin who is no longer alive, but this man was married to a woman who is alive and who is my second cousin, and lives in Prague. And of course we didn't know it at the time, otherwise we would have gone to see her. But subsequently I've been back a couple of times and seen her, and I've also seen her daughter who lives in Heidelberg. And she is related also on my father's side, but not through these 5 grandmothers from the others, I guess through my father's grandfather. No, through my father's father, from my paternal grandfather's side. So I do have indeed another third cousin.
Well, that's nice. Huh?
Yeah.
Now, let me ask you, what do you recall about the sort of family situation you had before you left home? Were there a lot of relatives around? Was it sort of a very active home? What do you recall about it? I know you're quite young, but...
No, I don't recall anything about it, except I know about it. In other words, we have so many photographs and so much written things, and of course what I also heard from my aunt, because as I say, my aunt survived the war, and then for 8 years when I was a student in the States, I was close to them, and then subsequently, I mean, they came and visited us in Israel and so on. She just died. In fact, we brought her to Israel in 89. She died in 89. She had been living in New York. Her husband died in 1965, and she'd been living by herself in New York. And finally, when she was very ill, and she was just close to 90, we brought her to Israel, and she was in a home in Israel for a couple of months before she died. But so I knew many things from this aunt. So I know that the home was, although it was more or less out in the sticks, I guess you would say, it was a very active sort of place, and there were lots of relatives and lots of friends. My parents were quite well-to-do, and so it wasn't a problem for people to travel, or they traveled also with me. So there are many, many photographs of them visiting relatives, and I think it was a very close family, because I know one of the stories is that my parents actually had visas to leave, and I'm not sure whether they had a visa to the States. In fact, I have the affidavit that somebody in Colorado wrote for them to come to the States in, probably that would be 1939, but I know that they had visas to Shanghai, and they didn't leave because my father didn't want to leave his old mother at that time. The interesting thing that I learned now when I was there in May from a man who had been my father's assistant in the factory, who I met for the first time now.
What was his name?
His name, I think, is Hassa or something. He's a Czech, and he's a pretty old man. I don't know if it's on this piece of, no, I don't have it here. I met him, and I also met a woman who had been the house maid in my parents' home and had looked after me as a baby for the first time. And she was very excited and not very coherent.
How did you find her?
This was all through the people who now own the house. We found her because the people who own the house have a 12-year-old son who has an English teacher who has an elderly aunt who is this woman. And she lived in the house, and her husband was a sort of general factotum and gardener, I guess. He's not alive anymore. And she's got to be in her mid-80s, and she was not altogether coherent. It was really quite amusing because she kept saying, "But he looks like Tommy," and they kept saying to her, "But he is Tommy." Of course, she only spoke Czech, and so that was. But so this man who I met also through the people who now own the house told me that my father was really quite a strict sort of character and very conscious of his social position, whereas my mother was much more easygoing and was very friendly with all kinds of, the village women and the people. She was very much into sports and cooking and things like this. So she was much more social sort of character. But it turns out that the person who insisted on sending me was my mother, not my father. My father didn't want to send me at all. But my mother was a strong one in this case. And that's why I went on the Kindertransport.
Now, you learned this, your aunt and uncle lived in the same town then as your parents?
No, they lived in this town called Stribro in Sudetenland.
So how is it then that they were able to learn all this about your parents?
Well, before the war, they were in very close contact. Mm-hmm. They would often go to visit. And as I say, it was a pretty tight-knit family. I know there was a lot of interaction. And my mother's side, there were the two sisters, or my mother and my aunt, and they were very close, although they were very different characters. And on my father's side, let's say there was a brother and a sister who had families of their own, but as far as I can see, judging my photographs, they would get together pretty often for all kinds of occasions. And, so it was a pretty close-knit family, even though they were physically spread apart.
Do you know who sponsored you for the transport?
Yes, it's on the list. If I looked up that pile of stuff that you have, and on the list appears the name of the woman who is my foster mother. I think it was some religious, maybe through the synagogue organization, because the family where I went, it was not particularly religious, but they were Orthodox.
I have that list somewhere. It's not in that group.
Yeah, if you've got that list, I appear there. My name is not spelt entirely correctly.
How did they spell it?
They put a G in it, so it came out Bergman instead of Berman, yeah.
Did you have, I guess at some point you had to change that, right?
No, because nobody ever noticed that.
Oh, okay.
Also, it used to be spelt, and in Czech it's spelt with two N's at the end, but...
Now, tell me, how is it that you came to be with a family that became your foster parents?
Oh, well, they had applied. They said that they would be willing to take a child, and they wanted to take a girl. And apparently they were told that no girls were available, but that this they could have this angelic little boy. And when I turned up, I was very anything but angelic. I gave them an absolute hell of a time. I went straight under the table and scratched and spat and didn't let anybody near me. When we first came to Britain, I spent apparently a week at some rabbi's place. Somebody called Rabbi Rabinovich, I think was the name.
I think he was the chief rabbi at that time.
I don't know. Mm-hmm. And then I was shipped up to Glasgow. Notice I was sponsored by something called the Jewish Weekly Appeal Fund. 1 Minster Road, London, Northwest 2. And it was a personal guarantee of my foster parents, Mr. and Mrs. S.K. Miller. Now, Mr. Miller died in 1947. And my foster mother, I say, is still alive. She's just over 90.
What's her first name?
Her name is Fanny Miller. Mm-hmm. And she's an amazing woman. And she's become a sort of mascot of the ROK people in Scotland. You know, they bring her along to all their meetings and so on. She's very excited. I don't know, you probably didn't talk to somebody called Dorit Sim. You did talk to Dorit, okay.
I know she's more or less sort of an organizer.
Yeah, she does. Yeah, she's a very mixed up lady at this point. We were a bit... disturbed by Dorit, and we'll contact her now when we're in Scotland and see how she's getting on. But that's another story.
Yeah. So this is with Dorit. That's a new development that she's becoming.
No, Dorit. I met Dorit first in '89 at the ROK meeting, and she became very excited about the whole business then, and. Became so excited about it that she organized this group in Scotland and so on. But her husband died about 1.5 years ago. And I think since that happened, her husband was a Protestant minister, very nice man, and very supportive. But I think since he's gone, the whole business of her roots is really, really getting to her, and we had a very disturbing impression of her now in Jerusalem. You know, so I mean, she hadn't slept for 2 or 3 days either when we saw her. So we'll certainly contact her when we're back in Scotland now.
Now tell me a little about, you came to the United States in, you said 1950, was it? 1956?
Yeah.
And where did you go? Where did you study? Tell us about that.
Oh, well, it was very simple. I had been in Israel since in 1952 I came to Israel. And then I was in the army, and I had this aunt and uncle in the States, and I didn't like the army very much. And when I was about to finish the army, my aunt and uncle wrote to me and said that I should come and study. And I said, well, there's no way I can do that, because they had only been in the States a few years, and they certainly didn't have the wherewithal to support me through college. And they were on vacation someplace, met a couple of people who said that they thought there was a scholarship at Rutgers for for foreign students in agriculture that had been endowed by a man called Waxman, who was the discoverer of streptomycin. So they wrote to Waxman, and Waxman wrote back saying, yes, indeed, there was such a scholarship, but that he didn't administer it and that they should apply to the appropriate committee, which they did. Anyhow, the upshot of this was that I got a scholarship for $700 a year, which was about half of what you needed then, and I came to Rutgers to study agriculture. And I thought I was coming for a year, and I stayed for 8 years. So I finished all my university education. After 4 years at Rutgers, I went to MIT, and in 1964 went back to Israel, by which time I had one wife and 2 kids and another one on the way. And we returned to Israel in '64.
Now, what did you study at MIT?
Microbiology. Yeah.
And what do you currently do professionally?
Oh, well, I run a research lab on Lake Kinneret. This lab has a mission to understand what is going on in the lake in terms of water quality, because the lake supplies somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of Israel's total water needs annually. So we have about 40 people in the lab studying various aspects of the lake ecology. And currently, well, I set this lab up in '67 and have been there ever since. And I was the first director for a few years, and again since '86 I've been running the lab, and my own research is involved in aspects of water microbiology.
And this, as a result of this research that you've been doing there, that's what's been bringing you go to conferences and report.
Yeah,
this.
sure.
It's been applicable to other areas.
Oh yeah, sure. We do a lot of. It's not work that is specifically. Well, obviously the work is applied to the Kinneret, but we have quite a reasonable international reputation, and part of the game is indeed our many contacts all over the place. And we also have consulting and our cooperative research projects all over the world. We have one in Chile. I was just in Hungary. We're going to start one in Turkmenistan. We've got a program going with Australians. We have another with Japan. So, and with obviously with the States and with Germany. So we have a lot, and we're trying to get some things going in Czechoslovakia, but we haven't managed that yet.
Do you speak any Czech?
No. The only Czech I understand now is because in college I studied Russian. So there are some commonalities, but of course Czech is a West Slav as opposed to an East Slav language, which Russian is. And the answer is no, I don't understand any Czech.
Why did you study Russian?
I just felt like it. Well, it was something I was hoping to be able to read literature in Russian, and that's pretty difficult. But I took a very intense 2-year course at Rutgers. So after that, I could sort of manage, and we went to the Soviet Union in 1960. And the nicest thing that happened to me there was that somebody said to me, they knew that I was not a Russian, but they wanted to know which of the republics I was from. So that was a nice compliment. And then recently, with the wave of Russians coming to Israel, and we had quite a few of them on our kibbutz, and I have, at this point, 4 scientists in my staff who are ex-Russian. So last few years I've been using it again. But Czech is, it was very, well, maybe it wasn't strange now, because we spoke Czech at home. And about half a year after I got to Scotland, a family friend came to visit me in Scotland and spoke to me in Czech, and I didn't understand, or I didn't respond. So it may well be that I kind of wiped it out. I've always wondered about that, because it should be there. And I've thought of things like, trying to get it out by hypnosis, because I had the vocabulary of a 5-year-old kid, but, that was the language that I spoke then. Yeah. It was my first language. But at this point...
Now, how did you learn about your parents having perished?
Well, of course, we had letters from them first frequently, and then less and less frequently. And then the letters, which originally went probably directly, for a long time we were getting letters through Switzerland and through the Red Cross. And of course, by the end, these were just mere sentences. And we must have learned finally from my aunt and uncle, who after the war had of course tried to find out what the fate was of the family. And in fact, fairly recently, only about 3 or 4 years ago, I went to Kibbutz Givat Chaim in Israel, where they have the archives of Theresienstadt. And there you can look at the family name, and you can see the dates when people arrived in Theresienstadt, if they died in Theresienstadt, or when they were shipped to Auschwitz. So I know exactly the dates when my parents were shipped to Auschwitz. Mm-hmm. But of course, more than that, I don't know. Yeah.
You said that there was correspondence. You were quite young, 5 years old. So your foster parents, they must have helped you writing, or? Presumably,
yeah. Yeah, I'm sure they did.
And do you have the letters that your parents had sent you?
I have some of them, quite a few of them, that in fact, probably most of these are still in Glasgow, and one of the things that we're doing now is collecting a whole lot of stuff, because as I told you, when I was in Glasgow last May, I helped to move my foster mother to this old age home. So a whole load of things like some family silver and boxes of letters or envelopes of letters have been kept, and there in Glasgow we'll probably take some of these now. But I have some key letters I have at home, and in fact one letter which is made quite a lot of waves appears in this book which I see over on your shelf there, this I Came Alone book. Yeah. If you look under my contribution to that, that is a letter from my mother written to my foster mother when I first came. And I understand that they're using this letter quite a lot for, educational purposes.
Let's see.
Yeah, I'm listed there alphabetically.
do the double N on here.
Yeah, I think so. Oh, it's got to be in. Okay, there's my parents. Yeah. Okay, so my contribution in here is essentially just this letter. Again, it's kind of amazing because my mother knew English, but had never been in an English-speaking country.
Well, that's good. Okay, it's good to know. Now, let me ask you, why did you decide to move to Israel?
You've probably run out of film or something. That thing is
blink.
It's blinking. Yeah.
5 minutes.
Yeah, I've got to watch my time as well. Actually,
Yeah, what time is it?
I've got to. I should quit here by 11:30.
Okay. So, why did you decide to move to Israel?
Oh, well, that was also very logical and simple because I had for years been a member and active in Habonim, Zionist youth movement, and there the path was clearly defined. We first went on training farm in England for supposed to be about 2 years. I was there for 1.5 years, learning how to be farmers, and the goal was to go to Israel to live on kibbutz and be pioneers in building up the new state, which is precisely what I did. I spent 1.5 years in training farm down in England, very close to where Nicky Winton lives, incidentally.
What was the name? Do you remember?
Sure. Hurst Grange in Berkshire, Twyford. And at that time I had a very broad Scots accent, and they couldn't understand me and I couldn't understand them. And it was terribly hard. I'd never worked in my life before. And working with all these local yokels. And first I could only think of how to get out of it, but I couldn't find an easy way. So then we ended up going to Israel in 1952, and with a group, there were about 20 of us, and we spent 1 year at a place called Galed, kibbutz in the Carmel Hills, and then we went into the army, and in 1956 finished the army, and later, towards the fall of '56, came here as a freshman at Rutgers.
Now, how has it affected you, kind of meeting all these other kin and connecting with all these other people?
That's a hard one to answer, honestly. Some of the people I find that I have immediate rapport with, maybe not too many. Like, I feel very close to people like Vera Gissing, and obviously to Nicky Winton. I don't know Barazetti well enough yet, as well. I've only really met him twice. In fact, his daughter's supposed to be getting us theatre tickets to a matinee in London when we're there next week. But I suppose it certainly brought on a outburst of trying to put some of these photographs in order and get all this family stuff arranged. And my youngest daughter, actually, the one that's in New York, also has met Winton, and also she came one of the evenings to the Kindertransport reunion in London, because at that time she was in London. So certainly it's made me much more aware of what happened. But it's really hard to answer that question. I don't know if I can honestly say that I've been deeply moved by it. I don't know. It's obviously made me think about the whole episode much more, and about what did happen in total. But it hasn't made me say bitter or vindictive or you see, I never had any problem with this roots business. I always told people I was associated with 3 unfortunate minorities that had rather difficult, unfortunate histories. That's the Czechs, the Jews, and the Scots. But that has never been, I've always wanted to live in Israel, and I've lived in Israel. And one thing it has done, I suppose, is made me much more conscious of my Czech background. And I like going back to Czechoslovakia now, and I have a number of friends there and sort of feel at home. And another strange thing is that when I look at the Bohemian countryside, I was telling this to someone the other day, when I think of countryside, that's the sort of countryside I think of.